Stephanie Gray Connors. What an absolute honor to have you on the Drawing Flame podcast.
So we're just starting right now, but is everyone going to know we were like laughing our heads off for the first half an hour?
No. It always just starts sort of very solemn, and nobody knows what the levity and joy,
context.
the mirth we've had before.
And I've just revealed that.
And now they know how much fun we are.
Yeah.
So you came up from Florida.
I did, yes.
How was your flight?
Well, the flight was good, but I had a funny experience because, you go through the machines now. I don't know what the machine's called, this machine,
Scanner.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's called that.
But it's a very particular, and I just, being pregnant, just didn't want the X-ray exposure.
Yeah,
There's
for
mixed
sure.
views on that. So one of my mom friends said, ask for a pat down. So
I'll take the X-ray.
I put my bags in, and I said, oh, excuse me, I'm pregnant. I don't want to go through the machine. Could I have a pat down, please? And they're like, sure, you just have to stand over there. So I'm standing over there. It's taking forever. And I said, excuse me, I got to catch my flight. And they're like, there's no woman. We need to find a woman.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, because only women can pat down.
Sure.
I guess. So they're taking, so then I wait a little longer. Everyone's filing past me, looking at me like, why are they not letting the pregnant woman through?
Yeah.
So I finally say to the guy, look, I'll take a man. I just want to get it done. And he said, I'm sorry, ma'am, we can't do that. And I said, well, what if I identify as a man? If I identify as a man, can I get a man? Because I would just, and he looked at me, he goes, that is a very pregnant belly you have, man. Like,
It also could be a beer belly. Yeah.
you cannot identify as a man.
So good.
Yeah, and I was a little offended by that. I thought, these days.
This is where we draw the line.
I know.
Right here, right now. That's where
The TSA line.
TSA line.
Although they have birthing people now. You could
I
have been
said
a birthing
that to him.
person.
I said, look, even the medical literature refuses to describe me as a woman. It calls me a pregnant person. He's like, I'm sorry, ma'am. So I finally got the woman.
Hotbed of conservatism. TSA.
The
the TSA.
She verbally
Florida,
briefs
though, I
me. Yes, it was Florida still. That's right. I'll compare when I leave from Pittsburgh.
From Pittsburgh.
What it's like.
Blue collar. That's steel. That's blue collar. Yeah.
So she does the whole thing, and when she was back here, I wanted to say, could you just give me a little massage?
A little lower.
But I thought, I don't think they'd appreciate that type of humor, so I was silent. I just wanted to get to my plane.
Get through.
So I made it.
Okay.
Here I am.
You made it. How's it been? Have you ever been to Steubenville before?
I have.
Okay.
Yes, but never at this time of year. Or have I?
It's so beautiful.
It's cold, though. I'm Canadian, but I've been in Florida for 3 years, so this is cold.
How did you get from Canada to Florida? What brought you to...
Well, I boarded a plane.
Do you have a kind of confrontation with the Canadian equivalent of TSA?
Have I? You'd think you would in Canada, but...
Does Canada have a TSA?
They're too
What's the-
friendly.
Oh,
Too friendly.
Oh, that's true. It's probably different initials.
Do they have anything? Any security?
Oh,
I
yeah,
imagine
no, they
everyone's
do.
like,
Oh, trust me, they
go
do.
on through me.
Yeah, well, it depends on who you are.
That makes sense.
I met an American, so that is how I got from
You're
Canada.
married to an American.
I am married to an American, very happily married. In 2008, I wrote a list of what I wanted in a husband. Now, I didn't get married till 2020, so let's just say it was a long list.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wrote in 2008, no joke, was I want to marry a man. Now, it was a long list. We're talking about 8 pages.
Okay.
Just a man.
Yeah. This is like a short list.
No, I interrupted myself.
Oh, okay.
I want to marry a man who loves the U.S. as much as I do. I wrote that in 2008, and then I got an American
Dream big.
who loves the
Dream
U.S.
big, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Shoot for the
Why do you love
stars.
America so much? I mean, this is actually an interesting. Coming from Canada, what makes America so
I know
lovely?
I'm a very unusual Canadian, actually, sadly. I'm sorry. The freedom. And now I think, so the freedom is a big thing now, especially. I really notice the difference between Canada and the U.S. Religious freedom, in particular, even though that's under attack here, I always tell people it's worse in Canada. Even the church here, when Americans complain about it's not so orthodox, I'm like, it's worse in Canada. So it's like, everything's always just a little bit better. The shopping, we don't have Macy's.
We lost our Macy's.
Well, I know that.
We're
yeah.
not the litmus test. Most of
But I think for me, especially in 2008, I was already full-time in the pro-life movement. So I was already,
interesting, yeah.
I had support in the pro-life movement in Canada, but it's a smaller movement. And then I was doing some speaking in the US. And so everywhere I went, I was meeting really on fire, amazing Americans who love the Lord and want to change the world and are doing that in each of their communities. And so it gave me a very positive view of Americans in America.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
I don't
So
know.
we're here with your new book,
Yes.
My Body for You, a pro-life message in a post-Roe world. You mentioned, okay, so you get into the movement.
Yeah.
The pro-life movement. How'd you get into the pro-life movement? How does this happen?
Yeah,
for you?
so in my case, it was really, I was raised in it. Both my parents from the time I was in utero were passionate about the issue.
Both Catholic?
Yes, cradle Catholics. Actually, and my dad grew up, in a sense, you could say like a persecuted Catholic. He grew up in Scotland.
Huh.
I have older parents, so my dad actually remembers World War II bombs being dropped on the shipyards in Glasgow in Scotland, and he was
Unbelievable.
just a little boy. But Scotland was very Protestant. And so when Dad was a teenager trying to get work, people would ask him what school he went to find out, and that would indicate whether he was Catholic or not. If he was, and once he said St. Martin's Academy, they'd like, that was it. Dad wasn't getting a job.
This is a wild tangent, but I'm gonna okay. For the audience, Stephanie asked me before the show started if I was Indian.
Come on, I think.
I'm not, right? However, interesting. So you know how in India there's still the caste system, right?
It's a wild tangent.
Wild tangent, but it has to sort of. We're talking about Catholic Protestant sort of discrimination. So very often, if you meet folks from India, they will have their first name and just the last initial.
Oh, to avoid
being identified,
Yes.
because you can tell what caste somebody is
Yes.
in based on the last name.
Yes.
And so it'll just be, such and such N or such and such P. Anyway, that thought,
Well,
so
yeah, it
using the
goes to
school as a
show,
litmus
right?
test,
Yeah,
or-
if it's whether it's a family name or a school,
Yeah, yeah.
people look to certainly identify, or even these days, like, oh my God, a miraculous medal on, or
yeah,
something,
for
right? Are we
sure.
revealing our faith? Jews, right? Do they,
Yes.
are they wearing is it a yarmulke?
Yarmulke, yeah,
Right.
sure.
So, so thankfully, my dad remained steadfast in the faith, and then met my mom, and she was a devout Catholic, and so they were cradle Catholics, and my sister and I are cradle Catholics, and.
So, of all the movements to get into, though, the pro-life movement.
Yeah, so of course, abortion became legal in Canada in 1969, in the US in 1973 with Roe v. Wade, which of course was recently overturned. So in the 70s, there was just a ton of controversy and news and all that going on. So my parents got married in the 70s, and they just were really passionate people. And when they heard all that was happening, they actually, and Dr. Bernard Nathanson, I'm not sure if you recall that name, he was a former abortionist who first became pro-life and not religious, then eventually converted from Judaism to Catholicism.
Sure.
He came to Canada to speak. My mom was pregnant, and she thinks it was me. She was like, was it your sister or you? But she thinks it was probably around 1980, so one of us. Either way, I was the second.
Particular love that's so beautiful, Mom.
So she waddles in at 8 months pregnant to Dr. Bernard Nathanson's talk and was just so moved by his presentation. And then her and my parents just signed up for the community pro-life group. My mom volunteered at a pregnancy center. Both my parents would go to protest. So that's what I grew up in.
Got it.
So then I would accompany my mom to the pregnancy center when she would visit or meet with clients, or when they'd give birth. I'd go to the hospital with her. So I always knew from an early age who the preborn child was, what abortion was, and I loved babies, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would do that. So I have letters that I wrote from the age of 12 and up to like local politicians and the Premier and Prime Minister of Canada, like, I'm Stephanie Gray and I'm 12 years old and you need to stop abortion. And then when I got the assistants write a letter back instead of the Prime Minister of Canada, I was really offended. So then I wrote the assistants and I said, I didn't write to you and I don't want to hear from you and I want to hear from the Prime Minister.
I love it.
So this time they just signed for the Prime Minister.
So Ohio, we're in Ohio, and Ohio's an interesting state. We just had issue 1 that passed. Brutal, right?
Yes.
And issue 1, this is what strikes me. So issue 1, essentially allows abortion on demand with very few restrictions or limitations. But in the rhetoric leading up to the vote, what you heard a lot of was people talking about life-saving care for women. That this, if we failed to pass this, we'd be denying women life-saving care, including miscarriage care and care when a woman has an ectopic pregnancy. And so it felt like that pervaded so much of the conversation. And you're seeing cases now down in Texas where hospitals are being very reticent to provide women who have ectopic pregnancies, which could be potentially fatal. They're reticent to give care because they're afraid that the Attorney General will come along and try to indict them under some of these abortion restrictions. Can you help us wade through some of this? So obviously there are distinctions between ectopic pregnancies and miscarriage care and abortion.
Right.
And I think it seems to me there's a move now in some of the rhetoric to conflate those, to muddy the waters and to sort of get folks saying, well, no, we certainly don't want a woman who's having a miscarriage to be not denied care. And so, but how do you see this, the rhetoric evolving? How do you see this fight moving? Yeah.
I mean, I think there's an intentional move to muddy the waters so that people's heartstrings will be pulled in these cases where people are like, this was a wanted pregnancy, but it's ectopic, it's wanted, and I'm losing my baby through miscarriage, and people are like, oh my goodness, that's horrible, you can't get proper medical treatment. So I would call into question the claims that these people aren't getting proper medical treatment. And then if there is a need to better educate physicians, then we need to do that. But I question whether it's less about educating physicians and more about people are misrepresenting the realities of the situations. In terms of miscarriage, I mean, I can say as a woman who's had 4 miscarriages in a state where abortion went from 15 weeks to 6 weeks in terms of its accessibility, before 15 weeks and then down and down. You know, I live in Florida. Never once did I think when I presented at the hospital or to my doctor or to the phlebotomist to get my blood checked with a miscarriage actively happening that people were questioning that I had somehow self-inflicted this and that I had brought it upon myself. And, you know, like I was always monitored and treated with respect. In my case, obviously, the babies had already died. I was not in a situation where I needed to have medical intervention, so I chose not to have a D&C or any medication and just let it happen naturally. But I had to be monitored very closely. So in my experience of losing 4 babies, I was always treated properly and with great responses from the medical community largely. In terms of ectopic pregnancy, so ectopic means out of the uterus, which typically is in the fallopian tube. And in that situation, all babies actually begin their lives in the fallopian tube in a normal active sexual intercourse, if we're not talking about IVF babies. And in a pregnancy functioning normally, the baby moves within about a week from the tube into the uterus implants and grows for 9 months. But with a tubal pregnancy, the baby gets stuck for whatever reason. There's many reasons why. And so the baby implants there. So as the baby grows, the tube grows. The tube wasn't meant for implantation. So the tube can expand and to the point of bursting, which if it bursts will kill the baby and can kill the mother too. So in that case, I do point out to people there are different methods of intervention, and they're not all equal. You know, as professors, there's different ways to get an A on a test, but they're not all equal. If one's cheating and one's studying hard and one's just being naturally gifted, okay, everyone gets an A, but it's not all the same. So when you have a tubal ectopic pregnancy, one method of intervention, which would be ethical, would be what's called a salpingectomy, which is a procedure where the section of fallopian tube that's expanding is removed. That section of tube is a part of the mother's body. It's a part of her body she doesn't need to live, that isn't designed for the child's growth and development, for that, you know, for the duration of a pregnancy. And if left alone, is a threat to her life and the child's life. It's essentially, at that point, a pathological organ. So what we're doing is responding to a pathology by removing it. And then if we could transplant the baby, we would absolutely do that. We lack the technology to do that. So in that case, we are responding to the tubal pregnancy, but we lack the technology to keep the baby alive. That's very different from abortion, which directly goes in and targets the baby's body for destruction. So an alternative method of intervention, which I would argue is unethical, would be methotrexate, where a woman takes drugs. Methotrexate is a cancer drug which targets rapidly dividing cells. She takes it orally, but what's also rapidly dividing, in some people it's cancer, but in a person with a tubal pregnancy, it's the trophoblast or the pre-placenta cells. And so if you take that drug, then you stop the cells from growing, but you're essentially targeting the baby's body, whereas the salpingectomy targets the mother's body. So that's an important distinction. But the point is we're still intervening, we're still responding, and we're still helping the mother. It's how we do it. And there's a lot of confusion, and people are not adequately informed of the nuance and even that these procedures exist.
Sure. Absolutely.
I mean, it does raise a question for me. I mean, I think it's interesting your book is framed as a post-Roe world, right? And I mean, I remember from the time I got to college going for the March for Life on these epically long bus rides from Miami up to Washington, D.C., and everything that was involved in that, and they didn't have enough seats on the bus, so I was on the floor, and they miscounted or something. Right? All these journeys, right? But everything was just about get rid of Roe, right? I mean, that was like the drive on everything was, I mean, that, at least to me, that was my perception of the pro-life movement and I mean, there was the active, pregnancy clinics, helping women with ultrasounds and, giving them care once a child is born and helping them, right? So there was the kind of charitable venture, but as far as the political activism side, it was Roe was the target, right? And so now we've gotten rid of Roe, and I guess it raises questions for me is like, how do we even get something like Proposition 1 passed in a state like, why this baffles me is Ohio, for instance, I'm not saying we have to review our political cards here, but the state of Ohio twice voted for Donald Trump, and overwhelmingly so, right? Overwhelmingly so. And then Proposition 1 can pass overwhelmingly in favor. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, is it that we're not able to articulate these kind of distinctions about ectopic pregnancy and miscarriage? Is it that the legislative strategy of someone, like the state of Florida, where we're going as, keep going. I mean, that's my home state. I love dear Florida, right? Going lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, which is the ideal. Mm-hmm. Are we like overplaying our hand? And if we took like a gradual, right? I guess I'm wondering is like, at least to a lot of pro-life people, including myself, is since Roe, it almost feels like it's become more discouraging, right? Because it's like Ohio is worse off than we would have been with that. Like Roe is actually better for us in Ohio because we didn't have this ridiculous proposition, right? And in a weird way, like it's actually gotten worse since Roe. Now, other states, it's not uniformly that way in America, but at least in Ohio, right? It's like, well, we were better off before Roe.
So I think one of the thing to celebrate was that there was this declaration with the Dobbs decision overturning Roe that there wasn't a kind of federal constitutional right to abortion. The problem with the response, though, was that it went state by state. And it wouldn't make sense to be like, well, rape is legal in this state, but illegal in that state. We would say, oh my goodness, rape is such a human rights violation. It attacks the dignity of the person that we say across the board it shouldn't be allowed. We don't let states decide whether rape should be legal or not. So in the same way, analogously, the attitude should have been, we're not going to go state by state saying, oh, abortion can be accessible here and not accessible there, because it's the direct destruction of an innocent human being's life. So across the board, or life, across the board, that shouldn't be allowed. But because we've yet to have that acknowledgement, then now it is going state to state, and then we're seeing very disturbing results where some places that we expect to be more conservative, right? That and I think there's some fear-mongering with the messaging, right? The examples you gave of people implying that people who are having natural health crises are going to find themselves without adequate health care. The other big challenge we're up against, and that's why, with the book, I really wanted to get to the heart of the matter from a faith perspective, is we're dealing with a very wounded culture. That if there have been, I believe it's over 50 million abortions since its legalization in America, that's 50 million women, or close to it, because some of those will be repeat abortions. So some women have had more than one. But that's then the corresponding husbands or boyfriends, the fathers of those children. And then how many millions are siblings of those children, or aunts and uncles. And so many people have been complicit with abortion, whether they've committed it or permitted it, or they even just have a loved one, even if they disagree, a loved one who's had one, they hesitate changing the law because of what it means about their loved one, what it says about what their loved one did. So that becomes the complicating factor politically when the real issue is emotional.
I think it's really interesting. It does seem that we have an interesting emotional connection. You were talking about how much you love America. I went to the University of Miami for my undergraduate in Miami, Florida, not the farm in Miami, Ohio. I learned there's a distinction.
There's a farm in Miami, Ohio.
Well, there's a school. There's a Miami University and a university.
There's a Miami, Ohio, is what I meant to say.
Yeah. There's a Miami University of Ohio. Yeah.
And until I came here, I never realized that this could be a real question.
Why did they call it that? Was it to bait people who thought they were
No,
going to
there's actually
Florida?
a Miami tribe of Native Americans, I think,
okay.
for whom it's named. I think. Don't quote me on that. I think that's what the origin of it is. Total tangent here. I actually have a cousin who married into the family. He's Pakistani, was living in Saudi Arabia.
I'm not Pakistani either. You pointed like I was Pakistani,
Only
but
because of
I'm
our
actually not
previous
Pakistani. So,
But
he was universal.
He was
face.
trying to come to university in Miami, and so he applied and he got accepted, and he showed up in America in Miami, Ohio, thinking he was going to be on South Beach.
Listen to this.
Listen to Saudi Arabia, man.
I heard a story about.
That's terrible.
This is like the tangent episode. So I heard a story about a Notre Dame was doing a scholarship. Now this could be sort of apocryphal, but they were doing a scholarship for an African student, one African student, full ride Notre Dame, and they do this essay competition and they identify the winner, and the winner shows up and it's this white person, guy, girl, I don't remember, and they were like, "Oh no, this is like a scholarship for Africans." And the person was like, "Oh no, I'm from South Africa."
South Africa. I was gonna say,
And they were like, "Aw." You know,
Anyway.
Yeah. I have a friend, a white friend
Miami.
from South Africa. People will say, "What's your ethnicity?" She says African,
African.
and they just look at her like,
Yeah. But I was thinking is Miami. So you're there in Miami. The University of Miami is significant percentage Latino, as is the whole city.
Right.
And many of my friends, I have friends who grew up in Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, name that Latin American country. And in some cases, their family fled to America, right? But one of the things that I found really fascinating to them, and this happened because many of these people were with me in the pro-life organization at the university, is they talk about Americans have this strange association of legality with morality. And I guess that in Latin America, they'd had enough bad governments over enough time, switching between Marxist governments, fascist governments, corrupt governments, all over the place, that they're like, just because something's legal doesn't mean anything about it. But I think part of what you're saying too about this emotional thing is, I don't remember the exact statistics, but they talk about almost overnight after Roe v. Wade came down as a decision, Americans' perception of the morality of abortion flipped. And a similar thing happened with Obergefell on so-called same-sex marriages, is that you had this similar flip, was that Americans have this perception of what the law says, and I imagine, I haven't seen the statistics, but I imagine something similar with legalized marijuana, that with the legalization of marijuana, the moral perceptions of marijuana. So I think it's one of these things that's interesting is like, part of this is we as Americans haven't got to a point where we're comfortable saying like our government could be so fundamentally wrong to allow this kind of grave injustice. Even though our history would suggest we've been pretty good at actually allowing this in the past with chattel slavery and a myriad of other problems, right? But so it is interesting when you raise like the emotional factor is, there's the emotional factor of persons who've been affected and traumatized deeply. I'm sure you have all kinds of interesting clinical insights on that. But also just from a national trauma, like can we as a nation admit like that we allowed this for decades and that
for
50
so
million
long,
people,
for so many.
right? And like to actually accept what that would mean as a country, about the country that we want to stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance and everything. Like Americans don't have a nuanced view. Like we want to be, Team USA, I think, and I wonder if that plays into the.
Yeah, I wonder if it could, especially because America is known for freeing so many people in places that have been victims of injustice and responding to plights when they've needed help, that it's like we have a strong sense of justice, which again, America does when you compare America to so many other places in the world. But at the same time, this sense of, okay, if the law says this or if the government says that, then I comply. It's like, well, hold on, we could be wrong. And so we have to look at what's moral, and then the law should reflect what's moral, not just make a law and then determine that that's moral based on.
So you've been in this arena for a long time.
Yeah, so I was raised in the movement. When I was 18 years old, an American speaker, again, came to Canada, and his name is Scott Klusendorf, and he gave a weekend-long presentation. I was blown away. A lot of what he did that weekend actually was apologetics. I've been described as Scott in a skirt. But he really taught us how to argue well. And I just have a kind of a mind for debate and a mind for argument, so I was really drawn into that. And then at one point, he was talking about the nature of the pro-life movement and those who support abortion, and he said there are more people working full-time to kill babies than there are working full-time to save them. And this was 1998. So although the pro-life movement is really in the last 20 years really expanded in terms of full-time working professionals, largely it was what I grew up with, which was people volunteering their time, which is wonderful.
Sure.
But if you only have volunteers on one side or largely volunteers, and on the other side you have doctors, nurses, right? Totally, that's getting government funding and everything else, you're overpowered by that. And so I became deeply convicted that weekend that I needed to be one of the people working full-time to save babies. And one of my friends from my college who had flown to this conference with me, Athena, she was as equally convicted. And so we flew back to our campus at the University of British Columbia, and we both said, we're going to work full-time in the pro-life movement. And a few years later, she joined the Sisters of Life. I actually write about her in my book.
Oh, wow.
So she's now Sister Antoniana, and so she's doing full-time pro-life work through the Sisters. And then when I graduated in 2002, I went full-time and have basically been doing that since.
So I imagine, and you've been, you've debated, you've had a number of sort of debates against prominent pro-choice and pro-abortion folks. But I guess my question is this. So is the best, your book, the title, My Body for You, an obvious play on my body, my choice, and you're taking Christ's words, this is my body given up for you. And so you're sort of correcting the distortion of my body, my choice with the words of Christ. But that is a decidedly religious approach. And I guess I wonder, I've never known in these sort of debates what role faith and religion should play. Do you become easily dismissed by, when you're in the public arena and you're talking about and arguing against abortion, I'm taking a pro-life position against family members or friends or folks who disagree with me radically, am I immediately dismissed if I bring up religious principles? Mm-hmm. So if somebody said, well, the Bible says, they say, well, I don't follow the Bible, so don't use that as a first principle for me. What's your experience in being in this arena and arguing? Having been in some dogfights, what role does faith and religion play? Should it play? What are the best approaches? You've changed people's minds. You have helped convince women not to get abortions. What's the best approach? And how should faith or religion intersect there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm happy to expand on answering because there's a whole backstory to why I kind of went in that more overtly religious direction, where the majority of my career has actually been largely non-sectarian in terms of how I argue, how I was trained, and then how I've trained others.
Yes, okay.
And the attitude always was, which there's still merit to, speak the language of your audience.
Yes.
Meet people where they're at. And so, when I spoke at Google headquarters, it was a very non-religious audience. I didn't make overtly religious messages, and there's a place for that. Over the years, I would meet some people, though, who would say to me, if we just want everyone to Christ, once they embrace Christ, then they'll embrace everything he stands for, so then everyone will automatically become pro-life. So we just need to evangelize and do discipleship and everything else. And then, and my attitude is it's not either or, it's both and.
Yeah, got it.
There's a place for meeting someone immediately with whatever issue they bring up at the moment, that, and in the clinical setting.
Absolutely.
But there's also the sense of, there's something deeper here, so I have to help them eventually walk them through to see the bigger picture. And as the years have gone on, and I've had more debates and, debating abortion doctors, and not only debating them formally, but years ago, the Holy Spirit convicted me to ask my debate opponents if they would do coffee before the debate. And my request was, with one condition, we can't discuss abortion, because that's what the debate is for. So I said, the coffee is just to get to know each other as people.
Yeah.
Almost every single debate opponent since I started that practice has loved the idea and jumped at it. So there I've been, at coffee shops, sitting across the table from a man who's just come from using his hands to kill babies. And is sipping coffee and has bought me a coffee, and we're talking, and he's talking about, his grandchildren, and, it's been quite a surreal experience. But as I've come to know these people on a human level and not just on a debate level, I really see at the end of the day, they need to know Christ. Now, we can find different ways of presenting Christ to people. But then in more recent years, and in my conclusion, I cite this in the book, I was asked to do an event in Mexico that was actually, I thought it would be really Catholic. It wasn't a Catholic event at all. It was a largely non-sectarian, largely even in one part Jewish audience or non-religious. And it was an event like TED Talks, but it was called CDI. And every year they do a debate, and this year, or that particular year, the debate was abortion, and it was an 8-woman debate, and there was 4 of us on each side. And I remember at the time I was living in Vancouver, and I went into a little adoration chapel, and I was like, okay, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Like, what do you want me to say in this debate? And I had a strong sense that I was to communicate the message of my body for you, and I was to use Christ's words. Even though I didn't, in that context, actually identify them as Christ's words. I didn't even have time in the debate to do that. But it was like, how do I take the message at the heart of what it means to be human and why God made us, which is to know, love, and serve him in this world and be happy with him in the next, and infuse that into this message of why we ought to reject abortion. And I tied in that concept by referencing that all of us were once children in our mom's wombs. And we know that because all of us have belly buttons. And I thought, I want to tie in everyone. When the debate is long gone, I want them to all remember when they look at a part of their body what I said. And so I was like, we're all different, but the one thing we have in common is our belly buttons. And that's a reminder we were all once in the womb. And all of us are listening to me today because when we were in our mother's wombs, she, in her power over us, because we were very vulnerable and weak at that moment, she in her power could have chose abortion and said, this is your body given for me. But instead, we're all here today because our mothers in their power used it responsibly, laid down their lives and said, this is my body given for you. I'm going to sacrifice for you. And we are here because of the sacrifice of someone who put others ahead of themselves. And the best way to honor that is to pay it forward. And then for others, when they are vulnerable within us, is to say, this is my body given for you. So, and then as the years have gone after that, I debated Peter Singer, the notorious Princeton philosophy professor.
How did that go? I didn't see the debate.
Oh,
I saw that in your bio.
Yeah, and it is on YouTube. I mean, it was, I felt it was intense because Peter, like a lot of the people I've debated, come across really nice. And so it's almost more difficult when your opponent comes across friendly because they're endearing and he's got the great Australian accent to his advantage. And he's very grandfatherly, so then some of the very horrifying beliefs he holds seem less horrifying when you come across nice, when you're known for other views, like he's known for effective altruism, he talks about, where, you know, encouraging people to donate their kidneys and donate more than a 10% tithe. And so you're like, on one level, this man is promoting and believing in great generosity that then some people will use to say, well, then he must be right over here because he's right over here. And that doesn't logically follow, but again, we're not always logical, we're emotional. But after I debated him, I really felt a sadness at his atheism. And if you read his story online, he's a child of survivors of the Holocaust, but he's not as I understand it, not a religious Jew, ethnically Jewish. And so I just felt a profound sadness, and I thought, he needs Jesus. This man needs Jesus. And so all of these things have like influenced, not really a change per se, because I believe there's a time and place to make a non-religious argument, but a development and a maturation and advancement to this idea that we really need to use Christ's example and show how it is a living witness through a pregnant woman and fathers who then help that pregnant woman, that needs to be the core of our message, that it's not my body, my choice, it's my body for you. That's what's beautiful. That's what's attractive and magnetic.
If you had to identify what drives abortion in the U.S., I mean, sort of the thing that you've seen the most when a woman's pregnant, like and I'm sure it's not one factor, but if you had to sort of pick one factor, like why women tend to get abortions, has anything struck you in all your years as, because I've had a thought, but I don't know if my intuition's right, and I want to kind of hear yours.
Oh, I want to hear yours.
You go first.
Yes. Ladies, he's going to make ladies first. What if I identify as a man today?
TSA says
a
no.
pregnant person. The TSA of Florida says no.
Not today. I'll tell you, I think it's fear. I always think it's fear of something, fear of not being supported, not being cared. It's fear that they won't be able to, reach certain goals or objectives. But it seems to me that identifying and addressing the fears, I've oftentimes felt like fear is this tremendous motivator, not just in abortion, in so many things in our life. I mean, fear is this sort of corrosive thread that causes us to act and react in all sorts of less than helpful ways, and sometimes immoral ways. But it seems to me there's always so much fear that oftentimes pervades. But I don't know if that's true.
I would agree with that. I was going to say something slightly different, but I think they're connected.
I want to hear what you say.
Well, and that's just that, people will say, well, because I was raped, or because my boyfriend left me, or because I'm poor. But at the heart of all of that is a set of circumstances where carrying through with the pregnancy is not the ideal dream that a little girl has for her future, right? Like, pregnancy has been challenging for me. Motherhood has had its challenges, but I am delighting in both of those things. I have a wonderful husband, a wonderful daughter. I'm excited about this baby, So there are so many things that are right with my life that even though there's little moments of hardship within, I can so easily say, yes, this is great. But if you have very major things that are off in your life, then if you come, for example, from a background of abuse and you're still in that, then you're like, I don't want this baby to be abused like me. So if you have an abortion, are you doing something terribly evil? Yes. But is there some good in your motivation? Yes. It shows like the human person is so valuable that they ought not be abused. It's just in your fear and in your misguided thinking, you're doing something else that's wrong to try to solve that problem. So I think it's something major being off. Even these cases, there's a case right now in Texas where a woman was 20 weeks along, has 2 other children, happy to be pregnant, wanted to be pregnant, and found out that her baby had trisomy 18. And so now was trying to get an abortion through the state of Texas. That failed, so the news claims she's gone to another state to abort her baby. But why abort that baby when other couples have carried through with a baby that has trisomy 18 and lose the baby naturally, at the end of that pregnancy? Why in her case? Is there some set of circumstances that are just too overwhelming or not ideal? And again, I don't know her personally, I can't know, but I can only theorize from the media that I read. But I think when things are majorly off and we're afraid, until we deal with that fear, even with this pregnancy. So we lost our first child, then I got pregnant right away with our daughter Violet, and then we just lost 3 babies in the last year, and then we had this baby. And when we lost the third in a row, which was our 4th loss, Job, we'd actually named the baby Job before we lost Job. We had seen him twice on ultrasound, heartbeat at 8 weeks, everything was good. And so we named him Job for the end of Job's story, where Job gets everything back twofold. Yeah. So not the Lord takes away, but the Lord gives. And so we're like, God has given us a 4th child after all these losses. And then we went to a routine appointment at 12 weeks, and the doctor put the Doppler on me and couldn't hear heart. And he said, don't worry, it's 12 weeks, it's early. Let's just run over to my ultrasound room. We'll look at the baby. And he puts the ultrasound wand on, and the baby is just still. And my doctor's face is stone face. And I thought, oh my gosh. And then there was no heartbeat and the baby had died. And as soon as we left, I said to my husband, Joe, I never want to get pregnant again.
How could you? Yeah.
And it wasn't that I didn't want more children, it's I didn't want more miscarriages. 100%. And so the fear of such loss after loss after loss, and the fear of all that had entailed physically, all that entailed emotionally and spiritually, I didn't want it again. That was a natural human reaction to suffering. Absolutely. But when we're afraid, we can't stay there. And so with God's grace, as time went on and the Lord softened my heart, I think often of that passage in Ezekiel, I will take your heart of stone and I will replace it with a heart of flesh. And as time went on through prayer and just having an amazing husband who was very much attitude of one day at a time, and just very gentle with me and how we view the situation, I suddenly came to a point where I thought, I want to be open again to life. And this realization that, and I write about this in the book, our goal in life is not length of life. Our goal in life is heaven. And one of the things I had to come to terms with when I realized I didn't want to get pregnant again was that my attitude had been these pregnancies were a waste because I never got to raise my child. And that's not true. The value of my children is not in how they make me feel. The value in my children is not in how long their lives are. The value in my children is that they are made in God's image, and that they, one day, in their case, sooner rather than later, which was very soon, they will spend eternity at the wedding feast of the Lamb. And they will be an intercessor for me and my husband and the rest of our family to get there. And so this realization that, okay, I can override the fear. I'm not going to entirely lose it, but I can jump over it with this realization that however long this child gets to live, and so far it's 6 months, however long this child gets to live, this child is made in God's image. This child has a soul and will forever live in eternity. And that's what I have to value, not how long I get with the child. But I was able to work through the fear. And if you don't have that support network and that spiritual foundation, all of those things, it's hard.
Yeah, it strikes me, I mean, you spoke beautifully to this, that part of perhaps is we have all this misinformation and everything else also, we also as a people don't talk about preborn children very much, right? You know, you'll hear people like, oh, don't announce your pregnancy until it's late enough that you know the pregnancy is going to go to term.
Yeah.
Or, you know, you feel like you just shouldn't bring up miscarriages in conversation, right? Like it's almost odd. Like, why would you bring up that, like, depressing information, you know?
Yeah.
My wife and I have lost children, right? So it's like, oh, well, why would you, like, you know, and so I think some of it is also, when I think of the pro-life movement, I think of that as a place where even in, like, deeply Christian and Catholic circles, we don't speak in a way that's pro-life in a kind of consistent fashion. Again, maybe because of the fear of, like, confronting the own hurt, the level of hurt we have, right? Or something. Because it's like, if we really were going to be consistent about talking about preborn life, then these would be children we would be talking about all the time or acknowledging. And it just, I mean, I was thinking about that. It's my daughter's first birthday today. So happy birthday, little Margot. Right? But it struck me this morning because we made this comment I just made this comment in passing. My son was sleeping in really, really late, and I needed to go to work, so I was going to wake him up to say goodbye. But I brought his baby sister to wake him up because she could just pummel him, you know. And so I, flung a 1-year-old on top of her 4-year-old brother to wake him up. And I go, hey, Bobby, it's Margot's birthday. You've been a big brother for a year. And then I immediately stopped and corrected myself. And I was like, well, you've had a year with her outside. Yeah. But I was just thinking, like even just in small verbal ways, we reinforce this idea that, no, it's been a year of Margot's life. And it's like, well, a year on the right? But it's like we find ourselves in linguistic knots that don't always reflect like the beautiful personhood that she enjoyed for 9 months in utero.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think, a friend of mine, actually, he and his wife, when they had their first daughter, they waited for 3 months, and then their birth announcement was, I forget what their daughter's name was, but we're celebrating 1 year of life in their little girl, because 3 plus 9 is the full year, and that's how they acknowledged her birth. But even, like when I'm out with my toddler and now visibly pregnant, people will routinely at the grocery store say, oh, this is your second. And I say, no, I have 4 in heaven, and I have these 2. So, and I have found the more I very openly speak of my 6 children, 4 of whom aren't here, people have opened up in remarkable ways. Like, complete strangers have said, oh, I've lost one too, or I have one up there too. One woman then almost broke down as she told me about her son, who died in his 30s, but just it was my willingness to be open about my loss that gave her permission to be open about her loss. And then from a faith perspective, a realization that it's a loss on this earth, but it's not a loss forever. And so that's why when people have circumstances that aren't ideal, and so they want the abortion because they're just overwhelmed with fear, that's where we need to inject support and a new perspective. And I write about that in the book with ministries like the Sisters of Life, pro-life pregnancy homes that do more than just let you be there for the pregnancy. It's beyond. When the child is born, they teach you how to fish, don't give you a fish. They help you pursue education and career so that you can thrive in your motherhood, even if it's a single motherhood. And so that's where we need to make it easier for people to choose life, with surrounding them with the community that they need, so that the fear gets decreased, even if it's still there. Even with this pregnancy, my husband and I have said, until this baby's born out alive, like, we're still going to have degrees of fear, but it's not an overwhelming fear. And so we want to help others get to that same place where fear is there, but they're in control of it. It's not.
Who's this book for? I mean, you have in there some really profound stories. So each chapter sort of has this little post-Roe application section at the end, like an action item. Here's how here's what we can do. There's some stories in here that are about women in tragic circumstances. I mean, really impactful stories. But who did you write this? Who was the audience in your
Yeah.
mind when you wrote it?
So I knew that the people that are likely going to read a book by a pro-life author on abortion are going to be pro-life. So I wrote it largely to the pro-life movement to help instill a deeper clarity and conviction in their hearts and help them as they interact with others. So that even if they're like, oh, do I use a non-religious argument or a religious argument, they might think of that story in there of the couple that had the triplets, where the doctors are like, this is too complex, reduce one or two of them. And they were like, no, we can't kill one baby to save the others, and that they can draw on that. That the average churchgoer who says, well, I guess the church says abortion is wrong, but I don't know, post-Roe, I'm thinking of these cases I'm hearing about in the news. They might be more inclined to read it.
Got it.
Because they'll resonate with, well, I hear my body feel all the time at church. Even if they're not as devout a Catholic, they still go to Sunday Mass, and so they're used to that phrase, even for our evangelical brothers and sisters who know that phrase of this is my body given for you. So that is the main audience, but it's still a hope and prayer that the Spirit will move in the hearts of people that are staunch abortion supporters who will somehow find this in their hands. I mean, there's a few abortion doctors that I'm still in touch with that I plan on reaching out to and sending them a copy. So we'll see how the Spirit moves.
Beautiful.
So do you have some like practical suggestions you want to share with us so that people viewing or listening can say like, okay, it's a post-Roe world. I may feel discouraged by, I'm thinking of all of our neighbors.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I don't think these people. I mean, we're talking about fear and hurt and everything else, right? Yeah, I can think of people who are like, well, time to move to West Virginia, which is just across the river.
Right.
I got to get out of Ohio. Ohio's gone mad. Right, so what are the kind of practical steps that we as, people who want to participate in the pro-life movement should be taking in the post-Roe world?
Right. Well, the realization that we're needed now more than ever, that we can't run from the fight, that we have to realize from a war perspective that there's battles and then there's the overarching war. So the reversal of Roe v. Wade was winning a battle, but it wasn't winning the war. There's still a major culture war to go on, but now we're seeing there's political wars in each state. And so to remind people that we ought to celebrate victories, but realize we're still needed. And so what that need looks like is huge. So then to say, where has the Lord placed me? What gifts has he given me? And how can I contribute those? So for someone who's, got a very counseling type heart, maybe they're best suited to volunteer at a pregnancy care center. For someone who's all about logic and debate, maybe they're best getting involved in a pro-life educational group or getting involved online, but being a winsome voice in the world of debate and not just, shooting down people, or not shooting down people at all, but shooting down arguments in a winsome and compassionate way and demonstrating that. And then our politicians realizing that if they put forward an improvement to legislation to make it a little bit more pro-life, that their job is not done. And that's one of the points I make in citing, a reflection of John Paul II in the book, that less than ideal political, what's the word? Laws and advancements are put across a politician's desk all the time. So there might be a degree of bills. Yeah, like what's the word? Pregnancy brain. Pregnancy makes you forget things all the time. But bills and different legislation that comes forward might be better than how things were, but still not ideal because it may allow for exceptions, like we're killing babies just because their fathers are rapists or whatever the case may be. And those politicians need to realize if they improve the situation, they still have a responsibility to continue to improve it, to keep moving to the ideal and get better legislation put forward. And if really bad legislation comes in that makes it worse, like we see in Ohio, then all the more we need our pro-life politicians not to pack up and go home, but to get deeper into the fight.
I love that idea. You said a couple things that I think are really important. So the first is, what do we need to do? Part of that is a discernment of looking at your own gifts and talents. And I've oftentimes thought, I'll have friends who go canvass neighborhoods right before elections or canvass neighborhoods about a particular pro-life issue, and that has just never felt like me. It doesn't feel like it fits my gifts, my talents, and I like this idea that we should play to what God has given us and sort of go where, follow those gifts, follow those talents, discern where God might be calling us, and to get in the fight there, to get in the arena there. And I think that's really helpful. I also love, too, that you don't shy away from some practical things here, because I think it's easy to talk about this sort of in the vague and the abstract but to give people concrete things that can be done, that need to be done, that can be really helpful in topics like this, especially coming from somebody who's been so involved in this. I mean, you've seen so much. You've been at the debate level. You've been at the front line of helping women one-on-one. To give and equip us with some practical tips, knowledge, insights that we can then take and implement, I think that's a real feather in the cap of the book, that it's not just an abstraction. Right. And there's examples here that take those abstract principles and you see them in real life. Right. And you see the complexity, and you see the humanity, and you see the fear. But then you don't leave us hanging. You say, like, here's what we can try to do.
Right.
And that to me seems really, really beneficial to people who want to figure out what to do.
And how, as you say, or as you allude to, how can I bloom where I'm planted?
Yes.
What are my gifts?
Yes.
And I think even as you say that, of a pro-life physician I was just speaking to, could he go and canvass his neighborhood? He could, but I think the best thing he does is live out his pro-life views with his patients and with his colleagues. And he was just telling me this phenomenal story. So one thing that can arise in pregnancy, which is a risk, can be a develop into a risk to a pregnant woman's life, is premature rupture of membranes. Before the baby would be viable. So then it's like, well, if we kind of encourage labor, then the baby's not going to survive and be dead. So what do we do? So a lot of people, if you have premature rupture of membranes, would just complete inducing labor and the baby would be born dead, and because they would fear infection risk. Well, this pro-life doctor told me he had a patient come in at 16 weeks. Now, babies at 24 weeks, you're considered viable. Babies have survived at 20, 21 weeks, but no babies survived at 16 weeks. So the average person would say, this baby's not going to survive. We don't want an infection to develop. Let's just induce labor now that the membranes have ruptured. This pro-life doctor said, no, there is no infection present. So I wouldn't be responding to that. This baby still has a heartbeat. This pregnant woman is still healthy, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give her very close, attentive medical care where we do whatever we can to avoid a risk of infection. So you're immediately on pelvic rest. You're given a very particular type of antibiotic, which he did for this woman. It was it was either 24 or 26, 8 to 10 weeks later. She didn't get an infection. She carried through with the pregnancy. They induced labor, and that little baby is fine today. She's about 4 years old.
Beautiful.
So that is a pro-life doctor who responded with concern for both lives and lived very practically a pro-life worldview, witnessing not only to that patient, the born patient and the preborn, but to the colleagues, his colleagues who would have responded very differently. That's him best living out very practically the pro-life witness. For someone else, it might be canvassing in their neighborhood, or it might be, counseling a woman who's post-abortive.
Yeah, that's great, because oftentimes you hear this objection that's like the pro-life movement cares much more about babies than like the mothers. And the pro-life position, I like the way you said that, cared for both lives. And in cases like you mentioned with ectopic pregnancies, and it's this doctrine of double effect, that you really are trying to treat the mother for something that's real and fatal, and there's a foreseeable and unintended secondary consequence. But the true pro-life position holds both lives, the dignity of both lives, and the sacredness of both lives. And I think that has to get across, that we're not, and the true pro-life movement too, like you said, these pregnancy homes, we don't just stop after the baby's been born. We shouldn't. And maybe you hear that talked about quite a bit. You only care about babies until they're born, and then you drop them, And maybe that's true in some cases, but if it is, to have this sort of consistent pro-life ethic all the way through seems really important as a witness. And that example, I think, illustrates, this doctor shows he's looking for the infection in mom, and he's paying attention to it, and he cares, and this matters. Mom's life matters. Baby's life matters. And
that's how my body for you gets lived out, not just in the pregnant woman, in that doctor. He's giving his very life day after day for his patients, saying, my body is for you. I'm giving my intellect, I'm giving my everything to try to preserve your life. And that's what the Sisters of Life do.
Yeah.
They've given, they are spiritual mothers who are giving of their life, they're giving of their bodies, so that women who feel they're alone know, actually, you're not alone.
Yeah. It also struck me, I love that you, and you've said this a few times verbally, just the place for even fathers. And this, and there's a reminder, and we can probably feel this, have all sort of personal anecdotes of the ways that I think there's a tremendous call. I mean, one of the things that I think I have always respected, while they're wrong about their final conclusions about the pro-choice and pro-abortion position, is they admit just how challenging pregnancy, birth, and parenting is. And I do sometimes feel like you can get pro-life people who act like, we just have the baby. And it's like, I was like, I sat there and watched that happen. And I mean, I have to admit, I think I'm a much more sensitive pro-life person, having like become a father and watched my wife go through pregnancies and births, and even just getting to like 1 year, like how tired I am after the not sleep that I've had this week from my daughter who has a cold and my son who has nightmares about Pac-Man right now. I don't know. Like, he played Pac-Man.
He's terrified.
You're like, shoot, why did I let him see Pac-Man?
Exactly.
No, for weeks I haven't slept since Thanksgiving because Pac-Man, the ghosts keep chasing him. Or whatever, and you're like, but I mean, right? So it's a way as a
I know a
father.
good psychologist, by the way.
What?
I know a good psychologist, so
Yeah.
I think it'd help him probably.
Yeah. But it's just the whole message of My Body for You is like, it's also just a reminder for us. It's like to just be honest when we're presenting and having a kind of empathetic heart of what we know we're actually asking of women and of families when we ask them to keep a child. To be honest about the full extent and then willing to actually go the extra mile with them because we've realized what we're actually asking of them.
Yeah, do they see that in our lives? Do they see us giving our bodies as an act of love, as an offering of love to our families, to our friends, or do we sort of have this, narcissistic navel-gazing, and we're saying, you offer your body up, you be a sacrifice.
Right. Meanwhile, over here,
I take care of me.
Yeah.
I mean, to be a witness, I think, in our own lives. It has been a delightful conversation. I think we can talk for hours.
Oh, thank you.
So blessed to have you. Check out Stephanie Gray Connor's book, My Body for You. She is on the front lines of the pro-life movement. The book is tremendous, a real gift to the pro-life movement and to the church. And for folks who are overtly religious, but also hoping it gets some secular traction, because I think that fundamental message of the dignity of the human person is so important. So thanks again so much, and keep up the great work and the God-inspired work.